Okay, you're washed out. Yeah, yeah. Sorry? Yeah, whenever you want. Sure.
I was going to wait till Ryan came back in the room, seeing as there's a kind of expectant silence. Maybe I'll... here he is. Let's get started. So I'd like to welcome you all to this IPEN brown bag talk. I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. I wanted to start, as I said, Ryan is here, who's coordinator as well of IPEN. I'd like to introduce or draw your attention to our upcoming event, The Dollar in the Age of Trump. Benjamin J. Cohen, who is a professor of international political economy at University of California, Santa Barbara, will be presenting. He'll be presenting at Carleton in the Canal Building. IPEN kind of has an ongoing collaboration with scholars at Carleton, so we continue to enjoy that collaboration. So I'm going to pass this around. You can have a look and see if you can attend that. And if you don't get emails from IPEN, if you're not on the mailing list, please do put down your details here so that Ryan and you can pass those along. This talk is going to be in English, but questions are welcome in French. Je suis très heureux de présenter Adrian Murray, qui va nous donner une présentation sur une maison décente, un travail décent et une vie décente, théorie de la reproduction sociale et organisation de la classe ouvrière at Cape Town. Adrian is, I'm sure everyone knows, a PhD candidate here at Adrian, working with Susan Sprunk, and I'm very excited to hear more about his work. So without further ado, welcome Adrian.
Thanks. Thanks, gentlemen. Yeah, thank you for coming, everybody. This is a presentation, a paper that's emerged from my dissertation, which is in the process of, you can say it's more or less forthcoming, so that's nice. I haven't revisited it in a while. I was on leave for a couple semesters, so I have presented it once before in sort of a similar format. So yeah, with that said, I'm going to apologize, or maybe I should, maybe you'll be happy to hear that I only have 4 slides. But that means that I'm going to be sort of like reading this as a lecture, more or less. And just to give a little bit of background about how this fits into my project, I'm examining the politics of public service delivery in Cape Town, South Africa. And more specifically, it's looking at the way that social movements organize. And so inquiring into the day-to-day processes of that organizing work. And so I've come to focus to some large degree on the relevance of class for organizing in social movements today. So this is an engagement of sorts, even though I don't reference this specifically for the interest of time and space in this version of the paper, but in the longer paper, as I'll note several times, I expand on some things that I glide over in this presentation. So with that said, I'll get right into it. And by way of starting, I just want to prioritize the voices of some of the folks that are involved in some of this organizing in one way or another. So I hope this...
For me personally, it started with me understanding how the world works and why things are the way it is. And that motivates me to want to bring change. And I also understand that it's only us, the poor, the working class, that can really liberate ourselves. And for me, it's imperative for me to do this. I have to do it because it's our future, it's our kids. Our dream can only be realized if we organize. So we have to build this housing assembly so that we can realize our dream of decent housing for all.
In Cape Town, the social engineering of apartheid included rigorous spatial engineering and urban planning. Since the 1950 Group Areas Act, wealthy white residents were able to live close to the city in suburbs with services of a first world standard. Plumbed homes and schools, drinking water and electricity, safe local parks, sandy beaches, and green recreational spaces. And everyone else? We were forced to settle east of the economic center in segregated suburbs with poor services and long work commutes. Natural barriers like rivers and valleys, as well as man-made features like highways, railway lines, and sewage treatment works, were used as barriers to keep our different racial communities separate. 21 years since apartheid ended, South Africa is still one of the most unequal societies in the world. Cape Town visibly reflects this inequality in our overcrowded eastern suburbs.
So, as you just heard, post-apartheid South Africa has been characterized by deindustrialization, rising unemployment. The numbers that were released on Tuesday, which reflect the fourth quarter of 2018, put the narrow unemployment rate in the fourth quarter of 2018 at 27.1%. The expanded rate is upwards of 37%, and it's probably a lot more given the accounting methods that are used. And this era has also been characterized by financialization and capital flight, wage repression, and growing household debt. And South Africa remains the most unequal country in the world, with a Gini coefficient of 0.63 in 2015. The wealth Gini is actually much higher. A World Bank report in 2018 indicated that the top 10% of households hold 71% of national wealth, while the bottom 60% hold only 7%. And these numbers have undoubtedly not moved a lot. If anything, probably have increased. What's more, that same bank report indicates that 76% of South Africans face an imminent threat of falling below the poverty line. And although poverty is a lot lower today at 18.8% than it was in 1994, 33.8%, using the USD 1.9 rate, it actually increased in between 2011 and 2015. So this is these sort of struggles that are being waged are extremely important, and this is sort of the context that they're situated in. So, already struggling in vain for the better life promised after apartheid, South Africans have responded to these material conditions, among other factors, of course, as the country has experienced widespread strike action and has registered some of the highest protest levels in the world over the last decade. Despite these mobilizations, the state and capital's ideological management of this constant fracturing of social relations, which is a result, has made it very difficult for a working class consciousness to emerge, which, as Himani Banerjee argues, relative to its ruling class opponents, needs a larger segment of maturing time. Various tropes are trotted out by the powers that be to rationalize the status quo, individual responsibility, migrants and the racialized or ethnicized other, hidden or third forces, the meddling of foreign powers, and the list goes on. Backed up by the coercive arm of the state and in the context of the constant grind of everyday life, which is exacerbated by the ongoing neoliberal restructuring of society, the ruling class has been particularly effective in disabling working class organizing in this post-apartheid marriage of markets and democracy. So working alongside organizers in the housing assembly, some of the folks that you heard from here, a social movement struggling around access to housing and public services in Cape Town, I've witnessed many of these disabling moves. Together, we've also become painfully aware with two interconnected trends that stubbornly persist on the left, and which are not limited to South Africa, of course, which serve to undermine and divide the working class from within. The first is a division between workers and the unemployed or community, and between struggles at the point of production, between struggles at the point of production and those around social reproduction, and the valorization of one or the other. The second, and very much related, is a distinction between struggles around class and those around place, read as the local or community, autonomy, and identity, which are apparently beyond class in various ways. While there have been important instances of these struggles coming together post-apartheid, and as I said, I delve into these historical and contemporary debates more fully in the longer paper. These struggles have remained relatively distinct both in theory and practice. In what follows, in an effort to overcome the obstacles to organizing that these concepts create or exacerbate, I draw on social reproduction theory, which I'll refer to as SRT, and the praxis of the Housing Assembly, the organization that we heard from, to argue for a reconceptualization or renewal of our understanding of working class struggle that takes both seriously the working class as it actually exists and the process of organizing. So I'll start by very briefly, establishing a critique of the limited conceptions of class, which I identified above and which circulate, before drawing on SRT to develop an alternative understanding of class, which sees struggles beyond the workplace around social reproduction, including those against oppression, as class struggles. Informed by this analysis, I will then explore housing assembly organizing in Cape Town and consider some of the implications of this. So, misunderstanding class then. The propagation of the aforementioned divisions are indicative of understandings of social struggle that either dispense with class entirely or hang on to it in an exceedingly narrow way. As David McNally argues, where class fanaticism refuses the rich narratives and struggles essential to genuine anti-racism, socialist feminism, and queer liberation, to take three examples, and in doing so posits class in the form of abstract universality, the politics of personal identity commit a parallel reification of the particular, refusing to acknowledge its internal relations with all of the partial totalities that compose the social whole. Both profoundly misunderstand class and or fail to take seriously the experience of the working class as it actually exists. While both perspectives address this experience, the wage relation, oppressions of various kinds, many of the diverse aspects of life, they do so partially. But rather than being experienced partially, people's sense of the world, or sense of being in the world, textured through myriad social relations and cultural forms, is lived or felt or perceived as being all together and all at once. In remaining at the level of historical appearances then, and addressing only partially the myriad experiences of working class life, these narratives are obstacles to working class unity and contribute in some way to the reproduction of capitalist social relations. In an effort to overcome these obstacles, I argue that SRT offers a theory and potentially informs a practice, together a praxis, of class politics, which is attentive to the diverse forms of experiences in capitalist society. So, according to social reproduction theory, social reproduction includes all those processes involved in maintaining and producing people and their labor power on a daily and generational basis. Taking the production of the commodity of labor power, and specifically from working class experience as its starting point, SRT helps to rectify the capitalocentrism, often economism that folks talk about, that dominates both narrow understandings of class and, I would argue, those that deny the utility of the category altogether. This only speaks to economics, therefore it's clearly not relevant. While many have drawn attention to the unity of production and reproduction, including Marx in Grundrisse and Capital Volume 1, although he left it more or less untheorized, its common illustration via spatial metaphor, the sphere of reproduction, the sphere of production, the home, the workplace, and so on, maintains this distinction between the two. SRT has picked up on this theoretical gap, and given the centrality and unique characteristics of the commodity labor power to capitalism, SRT argues that it is not enough to add processes of social reproduction to the economic analysis. It is necessary to define the particular relationship that links production and reproduction, and provide and link this theorization to people's actual experiences. So in its integrative analysis, SRT conceives of class struggle as unfolding within the broader social totality of capitalism, constituted by all variety of social relations. Now, while the separation of workers from the means of production necessitates wage labor and constitutes the workers' primary means of reproduction under capitalism, commodities purchased with the money provided by wages are not just articles of consumption, they are also, in combination with public goods and an enormous amount of gendered unpaid or unproductive in capitalist terms labor, the means of the production of the commodity labor power. So in the longer paper, I explore in more detail the dynamics of Mike Leibovitz's theorization of the missing circuit of wage labor, amongst other social reproduction theorists, as well as the work of social reproduction feminism, which is the strong current of this in Canada. The key argument made by SRT in this regard is that despite the centrality of the wage, the reproduction of labor power and struggles over it are much more expansive, and these include contests for the provision for workers' needs across society. This includes access to public services, water, sanitation, housing, hospitals, education, etc., and so on. Moreover, the needs of workers are not natural or constant, but are themselves relative and determined socially, such that the standard of necessity at which workers are reproduced is also enforced by a struggle between capital and labor. This enforcement by struggle applies not only to the level of wages and the commodities they can purchase, but also the level of the social wage, which public services can be included under, and the amount and schedule outside the workplace available to actually enjoy these goods. So the common understanding that social reproduction appears to take place beyond capital or free from its influence is thus questionable. Rather, it is impacted by capital indirectly through the state and other institutions that reflect the balance of class forces in society, and through capitalist social relations more broadly. Increasingly so, one could argue, in the context of the intensification of market penetration into spaces of everyday life. What's more, there's actually no abstract capitalism in the sense that narrowly economistic understandings of class often suggest. Rather, there is only concrete capitalism, which critically depends on the messy, complex set of lived relations carried out by differently gendered, sexualized, and racialized human beings. SRT offers critical insight into perceptions of difference within the working class and of struggles, often associated with the new social movements and struggles to end particular forms of oppression that many have argued that are beyond class. This is not to privilege class, and I want to be clear about that, but rather to insist that so long as certain oppressive forms of relations facilitate, rather than hinder the task of bringing labor power to capital's doorstep, argue David McNally and Sue Ferguson, there will be powerful forces sustaining racism, sexism, and other oppressions, and discouraging alternative forms of human relations. Now, developing this analysis is not just descriptive or analytical. Rather, as Meg Luxton argues, it actually allows for an exploration of the structures, relationships, and dynamics that produce these activities, and provides some tools for contesting them. Now, I just want to note, I'm going to get into some of the empirical part of my paper. I would like to note that as a result of attempting to conduct research that was movement relevant, the voices of women in particular and their gendered experience, which are at the center of the organizing process in these spaces, are also the voices at the center of what follows, which is also the reason for coming to using social reproduction theory and feminism in this work. So beginning with the mutual point of departure then, which is the experience of people in their everyday lives, I'm going to suggest in what follows that the praxis of the housing assembly is well captured by social reproduction theory, and that through an engagement of SRT's integrative theorization of production and reproduction, this can actually offer much to an organizing process, and to the task of building unity in times when people are fragmented both materially and ideologically. So housing assembly efforts begin with the patient work of organizing from house to house and street to street, bringing together the many diverse experiences. Just put this onto that. Pardon me. This work includes popular education, research, writing, and propaganda production, along with the no less important collective amelioration of living conditions and both local and more generalized direct action around poor housing and service delivery. The Housing Assembly has also led coalition building efforts with unions and other worker and community formations across the country. It now holds an annual independent political school to bring together community activists and organizers from around South Africa, along with worker and student leaders, which is really quite unprecedented in recent past, especially the independence of this. Most recently, the Housing Assembly has played an important role in the Cape Town Water Crisis Coalition, formed to contest the city's response to the ongoing water crisis, as well as playing an important role in many of the housing-linked land invasions that have taken place in the last year in the aftermath of the announcement by the ANC of exploring the possibilities for land redistribution without compensation. Rather than merely seeking to secure the simple amelioration of poor housing and service delivery, and thus remain mired in the immediacy of every day and providing service delivery and so on, The Housing Assembly organizes by engaging with the daily experience of working class households and communities in an effort to facilitate critical reflection, self-organization, and action, which SRT concurs with in terms of situating labor as the starting point of social theory instead of structures and functions, as it foregrounds the experiential and human agency. And not because experience is some repository of truth, but that's really key to constructing understanding and consciousness, since, as Amani Banerjee argues, it is through experience that individuals interpret or make sense of the world. So this opportunity for reflection, organizing, and action is crucial, given that few people have sustained positive experiences of collective decision-making, socialized resource allocation, or solidaristic non-competitive environments in to live, work, and play in our contemporary societies. This is reflected in the perception articulated by one organizer that the working class in Cape Town does not understand what is wrong as a collective. We are suffering as a collective, but we are fighting as individual households, competing, instead of seeing this as a social problem. Another argues that we've gone from communities to individualism, from communities to individuals. That's what neoliberalism has done to us. This atomization and the intensification of competition amidst normalized scarcity throws up enormous obstacles to the organizing process, both in how working class communities understand their circumstances and in the practicalities of struggle. So the divisions abound based on racism, sexism, no jobs, our own issues, as people are struggling to survive, says another organizer. These have been referred to as the molecular transformations, which this type of restructuring has caused at the most basic levels of everyday life. And these serve to disrupt socio-material solidarity and collective subjectivity, which we've seen organizers point to. But the link between between state policy and these conditions and organizing in Cape Town is clear, according to the Housing Assembly. And I quote, "People's conditions are an obstacle. The austerity and the neoliberal policies, it's almost like it lessens people's energy. People want to organize, but these policies and things that happen to us every day, positively, it's the basis of wanting to organize, but negatively, it puts you down all the time. You know you are in real need of water, and it's getting worse. You become despondent. You know these people that struggled for the ANC then, during apartheid. They're tired of struggling, so why must I struggle again?" This policy trajectory in the state and capital's material and ideological onslaught in South Africa, especially when it comes to social reproduction, is brutal, individualizing, and demoralizing, despite considerable expenditure on free basic services and a large social grant system, which currently has about 17 million recipients in the country. In Cape Town, these pressures intensified as the city struggled to cope with a drought and water shortage that reached crisis levels in 2017-2018. And the response, which maybe I'll just skip over a little bit, we can talk about it more if folks have questions, but it really resulted in, most of the response was in terms of limiting water consumption. The majority of the coercive response was directed at working class communities, in which people's conditions and access to water were really worsened remarkably. And this policy trajectory, or sort of orientation by the local government and the broader state, has enormous implications around water for overcrowded working class homes in both the short term, as they disproportionately suffered restricted access and escalating water bills as the shortage worsened, and in the longer term, as water commodification became more normalized out of the necessity of managing the crisis through restrictions and rising rates. So in addition to the atomizing effects of these practices, in a more sort of unorganized sense, Housing Assembly organizers are adamant that the state and capital have been effective in dividing working class communities more directly. And this is particularly so in the context of formal equality amidst a society starkly divided along lines of race and class post-apartheid, as well as gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and religion. Racial and xenophobic explanations of why housing and services are delivered to some and not others find fertile ground in this context. And for one organizer, Housing Assembly work is vital to overcoming these divisions, not by making statements for racial harmony or reconciliation activities infused with the nationalism of the post-apartheid Rainbow Nation, or some more regressive nationalism, many examples of which we've seen rising in the last several years, but by working in communities, going around, collecting people's demands, and I'm quoting now, speaking to them about their issues, relating to their issues in their own comfortable space. Because we're in the same situation, and I'm relating with your issues and the importance of why we need to stick together as the working class. So this praxis of having hard conversations with people about oppression, exploitation, and what freedom really means in the new South Africa, it renders critical this experience of housing, service delivery, and employment at the sensuous level of everyday life, in a way that it is meaningful to people, that is not just an abstract abstraction. And this actually constitutes a process of using experience to build a critical political economy of South African capitalism. This wholeheartedly rejects dominant and reactionary perspectives, locating their responsibility for the current state of affairs, in relation to housing and services anyway, in the failing of government housing policy, which is an unacceptable alternative to decent housing for all. The Housing Assembly then locates organizing as part of building a mass organization that unites the working class to especially reach out to and mobilize disadvantaged and oppressed groups, and link up internationally to develop a working class alternative. So this was really felt very strongly in 2015 in a short-term alliance between Housing Assembly organizers who were struggling around water cutoffs and access to housing in communities in a town outside Cape Town, and unionized workers striking around wages and working conditions, in which gender, race, and class differences loomed very, very large. And Housing Assembly, they helped to address the reality that workers and communities found difficult during the context of that struggle to see the common link between their struggles. And so one organizer said that we've come through the stage of being conscientized, talking about the issues. I'm living in the community before I became a factory worker. The community needs to support workers because that's our people living in the community. They come home and their electricity has been cut. They are living in backyards. So they also have housing waiting issues. It's one big thing that needs to come together. And it did come together in a variety of different ways. During that strike, which was a community as much as it was a worker strike in the workplace, pardon me, the following relationship between the state and capital was generalized over the course of the strike. That the municipality is the boss, and the boss is the municipality. And I think this occurred, as I said earlier, because of the increasing perception and reality that there's a lot of cooperation going on in the context of marketization of things that are necessary for everyday life that used to be sort of safe in some senses from this, even in a context like South Africa. So the gendered experience of productive and social reproductive labor was also vital in propagating an integrative understanding of the two spheres. And I quote, "It was the women that led the strike. The expectation would have been, after 6 weeks, women will start saying, but listen, I have a family. Can we not negotiate? Can we not stop the strike? But women were saying, let us go forward. It's the woman that says, I can't go to work today because I need to take my child to the clinic. It's the women that have been on the waiting list for 20, 35 years and there are no houses for them. It's the mother that goes to the factory that must go home and work at the end of the day. It's the mother that needs to go to the municipality and beg the official, can I negotiate with my little wage? Can you please put on my electricity? It's the mother that gets on the truck at 5 o'clock to go to the farm, to go and work, and doesn't see her household for the whole day. So for me, and I'm still quoting, it was important that women need to see that, look, this is affecting my life. Now is the time for women to get much better organized because they are the people being affected at the end of the day. And there's an important element to this that was generalized and extends beyond this example, which is the solidarity built between so-called African and colored workers, the former more often migrant Xhosa speakers from the Eastern Cape, predominantly occupying informal settlements, while the latter were more likely occupying formal housing. The relations to the state and capital of each group are mediated by the historical legacies of apartheid and are very particular to the farming sector as well, and are played upon to stoke the fires of fragmentation and demobilization in the face of which roving groups of women, mothers, workers, grannies, aunties, and their comrades, as they called them, worked from door to door and community to combat and in many cases overcome such divisions. The outcome of this learning process, which is in fact a learning process, as you could hear in the transformations of some of those perspectives, is more than just a sparking of critical consciousness and the development of abstract solidarity, organizational membership growth, or some sort of coalition building at an elite level. Rather, it also manifests in solidarity, in action around the refusal of water management devices, many of which are installed in working class communities, particularly in the aftermath of the water crisis in Cape Town and across the province, evictions and land invasions, collective provisioning to cope with commodified service delivery, and contesting policy. In other words, it is a process of transforming the immediate experience and future horizon of working class social reproduction in Cape Town and beyond. According to one organizer, it constitutes a learning process of getting our humanity back. So, to conclude then, for at least two interrelated reasons, informed by social reproduction theory, this paper argues that we draw our attention to understanding and engaging with and in the patient work of organizing carried out by social movements like the Housing Assembly. The first points to SRT's argument that struggles beyond the workplace hold the potential to challenge, disrupt, and overturn capitalist social relations. Struggles around housing and public services like those explored above directly confront capital's efforts to privatize social reproduction and represent the seeds of an alternative which seek to reappropriate and recollectivize the means of subsistence for all. The second is that a host of oppressive social relations are integral to capitalism. This means that struggles against... it's 25 minutes. Pardon me. This means that struggles against racism, sexism, and colonialism, among others, are potentially struggles against capitalism. Insofar as the internal relation of all oppressions with each other and with the capitalist totality is politically highlighted, such that struggles can advance a class as opposed to a sectoral or sectarian consciousness, an awareness of the unity of the diverse relations that produce capitalism and society. So together, these arguments emphasize the necessity for the patient work of organizing, of the sort practiced by the Housing Assembly, which takes everyday working class life as a starting point to spark critical consciousness and build broad social movements. This praxis, well illustrated by SRT, considers the struggles of differentially produced working class households and communities around social reproduction to be valid and indeed urgent class struggles against capital in general. This does not mean that all such contemporary movements are manifestations of a working class for its own self-development. That would be a silly idea, which has been propagated many times in the past. But rather that within these struggles lies this incipient potential, but only one which can be realized through struggle. As the British historian E.P. Thompson remarked in describing class as both process and relation, class and class consciousness are always the first, are always the last, not the first stage in the real historical process. Social reproduction theory helps us to theorize this real historical process and the importance of the struggles explored here, which, while they may be relatively invisible, like much of the work of social reproduction more generally, may prove to be an indispensable source of working class and social movement power in the future. Thank you.
Wow, so I won't try and summarize your talk, but congratulations. I think you'll agree with me that the integration of empirical information, the viewpoints and the perspectives and the words of the people you spoke to in South Africa, the integration of that with the theory and the beautiful writing. It makes me want to go back and revise the paper I'm working on right now and improve some of my vocabulary and some of my phrasing. Beautiful, beautiful work there. So I'll, do you want to take questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead and you can manage the questions from the floor, please.
Thank you all for listening to that. I know it was probably rather dry and too long, but yeah, thanks for your patience.
Can I hesitate to raise a parallel set of issues around HIV/AIDS?
Sure.
And what the two housing and HIV/AIDS do to the ANC? Because, as you know, there's a whole debate about the tripartite movements, split, etc., etc. It seems to me that what you're talking about gives some of the causes in sort of structural terms, and I wonder to what extent similar perspectives make sense or don't make sense in terms of the evolution of the HIV/AIDS movement and responses, and whether anybody's done it.
Yeah.
What is an environmental struggle referring to your particular relation to the water crisis?
Yeah, I read a book, the ANC in general, since they took power, have been characterized by massive corruption. Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma and following. I mean, the firms that were benefited were, I mean, European firms. I really can't remember the details, but they bought fighter jets. They had no pilot. I mean, the South Africans had no pilots. They had no. They couldn't even. The planes have never left the ground, and the money that might have went into social programs. So it's not a question. I mean, we're one of the factors of this social problems. It's not. It's the corruption of the people. The people who are representing the Africans of color.
Yeah. In your own opinion, why is that now we have crisis of water in South Africa? But during the apartheid system era, we didn't have that kind of crisis.
Mm. Do you have like a follow-up question regarding that, or
No.
just a statement that, okay?
Can I ask you one point for clarification? The video you showed?
Yeah.
Was that produced by the Housing Association itself, or?
Yeah, by the Housing Assembly. Yeah, well, it was produced in cooperation with War on Want, a UK-based charity. Yeah, so if you in 2015. Okay, well, oh.
So you said that 10% of the households are owning 70% of the wealth in South Africa?
Yeah, the top 10% of households hold 71% of national wealth, while the bottom 60% hold only 7%. Yeah.
So the question is there, aren't they also the people who are doing most of the work that produce wealth?
Interesting question. Okay.
If
Yeah.
they do, then how do you adjust
Yeah, I mean,
in the measurement of Gini?
yeah. Well, wealth inequality is not as high as or sorry, income inequality. The Gini is 0.63, but I think the wealth differences in wealth inequality is much higher. I think if you calculate the Gini, it would be up around 0.8 or something like that in terms of wealth, and that's a legacy of apartheid, which. Yeah. Well, I'll give a crack at these. In terms of HIV and housing, the parallels, do you mean the parallels in terms of campaigning?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's lots there, obviously. The social determinants of health, overcrowding in households, lack of access to water. I mean, the list goes on, you know. But I think that this type of organizing is probably the most effective in the sense that it's people speaking for themselves more than someone speaking for you. I think that organizing, the treatment action campaign and such, I think that was very, very successful organizing, perhaps a poor context. Other people could probably speak to this more closely. But I'm thinking of you, Lachlan. I don't know if your time working on those issues in Southern Africa, you could offer any insight. But I think that at a certain point, and there's lots of debates over this, that the type of nonprofit NGO-based organizing that got wrapped up in dealing with the state was sort of lost its popular steam and support at one point. And part of that was with the demobilization of civil society after 1994, which is really typical of societies undergoing a transition like that. So, yeah. The really interesting thing, though, is that the Housing Assembly, in their sort of statements around what they would like to see, like what does housing mean? It's kind of about encompassing all of these different demands around services, and decent housing also means that you have healthcare facilities nearby and jobs and so on and services. So it really does see health concerns as a key element of talking about that, not only in terms of connecting with people, but also as real priorities that have to be on the agenda. Unfortunately, this speaks to the corruption question as well, which is a big problem, but probably is many people on the left in South Africa have the idea that while corruption of this sort is bad and it destroys institutions and so on, at the same time, sort of legal corruption is very, very much, I mean, it's a thing I think the world over, but it's particularly bad in South Africa, I forget the stats, but if you look at capital flight and illicit financial flows through many, many means since 1994, like the amount of money is just absolutely astounding. It was most of that was probably not illegal. I'm not sure if it would be considered legal, but
Canada, at the moment, Trudeau or SNC Lavalin is facing the same thing. It's breaking the law, but everybody does it.
Yeah, sure. And also, I don't think that we should be perhaps that. We shouldn't limit it to, say, Jacob Zuma. Thabo Mbeki was probably less a culprit for the type of corruption that Zuma and his sort of faction participated in. But even Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now president, I mean, he was implicated in the Panama Papers. His rise to super wealth was tied up in some very questionable things over the years as well. So, yeah. In terms of the environmental movement, I think that particularly when it comes to the water crisis, I think people have been drawing attention to this sort of, what did those folks call it? I wrote a great book at the end of the 90s on environmentalism in the global south and the differences between full belly and empty belly sort of environmentalism, right? In Cape Town, in the context of the water crisis, the state's response was, and actually I had a little summary in there, but it's good to point out what was happening, just to be really clear about it, because it can sometimes be a little bit complex. So the response was to admonish residents for wasting water and step up the installation of water management devices, which dispense 350 liters of water daily before cutting off household water supply. The majority of those were installed in working class areas. While poor households are generally encouraged to accept a water management device as a part of getting free basic services, all households with monthly water consumption above 10,500 liters are now required to have such a device installed. This was very odd, considering that most working class households didn't use that much water. Why were the majority of these being installed here? The notion is like the sort of wasteful, undeserving poor, which had huge implications. At the same time, there were investments which were eventually canceled, but they were put into things like desalinization. Whereas, working class households are being told, no, it's your fault, you're wasting water. There was sort of there was good analysis done on it, but in terms of the city, there was no idea of, okay, what's a long-term, more sustainable approach to water consumption and water management in the Western Cape. At least not in a way that was sort of pro-poor, There was an empty belly kind of neoliberalism, environmentalism, neoliberalism, that spoke to those sorts of things. So, a big part of that story, though, is that most of the aquifers and water reservoirs in the Western Cape, and it probably holds the same for most of South Africa, are owned privately. So this is, again, a legacy of water resource management. Yeah, I think I should think it through a little bit more on situating this within like a broader, political kind of ecology kind of argument about this. I haven't done that too much, but it's interesting, the amount of water that folks are supposed to live on. And these water devices, they don't function properly. There's this one family that had about, I think, 14 people living in it, and they get free water because the pensioner, the uncle there, he gets a grant and he has indigent status, so he gets this. So they install a water management device so he can write off his arrears, which never actually happened, or maybe happened a couple of years later, but at least when I was talking to him it hadn't happened yet, and it was several months down the road. And the water comes on at 4 a.m., and then it dispenses about 70 liters and the water meter cuts off. So it's installed by a subcontracted company that only gets paid if they get the water meters installed. So they get, it was like a 12-year-old kid that consented for the water management device to be installed. So you can imagine they fill up the bathtub every morning at like 4 a.m. and then they have this 70 liters that they can use for the whole day. Meanwhile, a broader, sort of probably more environmentally responsible response might have been to look at investing in reducing non-tariff water in the system. which is, you know, water that can't be accounted for essentially. It's like you need to invest in infrastructure and so on. So that's about 25% in Cape Town, which is pretty good. But you know, like Manila is down around like 10% or 10 or 11%. You know, so there's a number of different things that can be done. You know, and it's very stark in Cape Town. So people see, you know, people up on the mountain with their big houses filling up their swimming pools until like, you know, sort of the final hour when that was, people were told, you can't do that anymore, you know. So, yeah. So I wish I had like a more reasoned and analytical answer for you, but those are just some of the thoughts, I suppose.
I suppose you could, just to jump in, I mean, it could extend beyond, you know, water quantity issues, and I mean, even in the video, the overhead sort of satellite imagery, you see sort of the manifestation of various forms of what I suppose you could call environmental racism, and you know, I'm just kind of wondering to what extent the struggle for decent housing or the struggle for decent life in communities incorporates other aspects of sort of, you know, a struggle for environmental justice as well. So are they appealing to, you know, to a certain extent they're living near large highways, heard on the radio too, that, you know, really severe air pollution issues involved in particular matter. Is the water clean? Do they have access to natural spaces, parks? Is there sort of waste management issues that are part of sort of community organizing towards?
Absolutely, yeah, they're huge parts. So as I said before, you know, access to things like jobs and hospitals, schools, parks, other areas. Those are all sort of included in that broader set of demands that they have. And then in terms of, you know, sanitation, wastewater, and so on, this is huge. And sanitation protests, which literally involve throwing shit, are often popping up. Interestingly, also in response to the water crisis, the public toilets that are, well, they're communal toilets that are installed in informal settlements. They've started to use sort of like water recycling from hand washing. And so they have sort of like a water recycling system to then go in the cistern, put the toilet in. So this is all great. But what's been happening is like something didn't get set up right, or experimental technology, and what you get is essentially like sewage coming up underneath the taps where the water, you go in the informal settlement, you go to the edge and you fill up your water jug and you take it back to your house. And so, you know, kids were getting really sick and so on. So it's all these like, it's little bits like this, right? Like, let's have responses to this that look at improving people's conditions. And they're all, I mean, housing assembly folks are, you know, all for the environment. That's a part of their whole critique of, you know, where power generation is going in South Africa today, you know. The public power utility has just been broken up into 3 different branches. And the generation sort of element of power in South Africa, although they have a huge potential for wind and solar, a lot of it's going to these independent power producers who contract to produce power, and it's mostly produced by really, really dirty coal. So people are trying to, you know, jump on board both like large and small scale policy initiatives and put them forward and support them around, you know, clean energy and so on. But where it starts for people is that we don't want to live like this anymore, you know. So that's really interesting, and also organizations that they work with around mining also address some of these issues. But usually it starts from people's experiences of their material everyday life, which is very, like, there's a lot of affect there. And that's an important place to start, rather than campaigns in South Africa around like 1 million climate jobs. People are like, yay, what does that mean? Like, no one's really done that yet, except maybe you could argue that there's been 1 million climate jobs created in China. I don't know. But you know what I mean? Speak to my living experience in a way that is, you know, living more harmoniously, or managing the environment in a better way, and that's where most of these discussions go. Don.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for the very insightful presentation after years and years, and it's nice to actually hear what it's all about. We're colleagues in the same program, just for context for those of you. So I don't know a lot about South Africa, which is another reason why I came, and to learn about your own work as well. So I have two questions. One is, it's interesting that you talk about coalitions and these movements, and I find that there's a catch-22 within these groups of people, is that you have working class people that need to work, but there's also this imperative to organize. So I'm curious, in the specific context in your communities, how is that navigated and negotiated? For example, you give an example of the gendered aspect where women have to wake up very early, and so their role will be different than men, and also in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of most of them are full working class people. How do they negotiate being involved in these and having a voice and actually earning a livelihood? And second is, do you notice any coalition forming between these housing assemblies and politicians or political, do they have alliances within the political sphere for support for their cause?
I have a question kind of following on a bit from, I guess, some of your mention of affect and some of the discussion as well about the environment. How does, and you mentioned place, right? You mentioned this kind of dichotomy between, universal type of ideas of class consciousness and struggle, and then the kind of very place-based struggles. So, bearing in mind that these are very difficult places to live, they are artifacts of apartheid and structural racism and structural injustices. How do people navigate between, drawing attention to the very difficult material circumstances and kind of stigmatizing life in a very poor settlement versus, place building and kind of positioning themselves as we are proud residents of this area? Is this something that is, this idea of a community? Some of the informal settlements I'm a little bit more familiar with in Kenya tend to be fairly transient, where you do have people renting, passing through, etc. But it seems to me that maybe the areas you're looking at are more established and people have ownership. But do these kinds of things make a difference? And how do people situate themselves within these areas in terms of, these ideas of, am I a proud resident of this area, or am I just a victim of this area? You know what I mean?
Sure. Okay, well, thanks for those. The material basis of organizing is a huge problem in South Africa. So in terms of you get to such a point of struggling to survive that I mentioned in that quote, that you're just despondent, right? And there were all those years of struggling during apartheid, and now, don't want to do it anymore, kind of thing, which I hear a lot from people. And yet these are the people that are, they're expressing a feeling, but these are the people who are organizing every day. And so, I mean, how can I say everything I need to say to you for kind of... So, when I talked about the quote talking about women being so important in that strike and community alliance, this is sort of an abstraction, a bringing together of various experiences of different women differently placed. So that was in a fruit packing factory out in the Western Cape. You probably get oranges and fruit juices and things from there sometimes, lemons probably. And so a lot of people are working in factories packing fruit. That's a very sort of feminized task at the moment. There's farm workers who work on the farms. There were city municipal workers. There were even people who work at the supermarkets that were involved in this. It was really, really broad. So, but within a particular household, you're usually going to have higher numbers of people. So some will be working, some won't be. People get the chance to have a job, and they take it, and maybe they'll their activity will decrease for a while. But an important part of the organizing process, at least with the housing assembly, is that they're getting away from this sort of official social movement organization kind of NGO model where everybody goes to the middle class area to the office and that's where the work happens. It's like everyday life in your own community. So one really neat thing that started was a a breakfast program where they'd make porridge for the kids in different neighborhoods. You go around, get the kids, get them ready for school, porridge, off to school. So you get like a little, and you get the parents in there, so they'd get the porridge, and then you get like a side of political education. So that's really interesting, talking to parents about their circumstances and so on. So very reminiscent of like Black Panther breakfast programs and stuff like this in the United States. So there's an attempt at that type of like socialized provisioning, collective provisioning, is you can do that anywhere. Like that type of organizing, you know, not this lofty, bureaucratized kind of stuff. So people are able to navigate this, but at the same time, I've seen lots of people kind of disappear, you know, as you get a job, or, but then they come back because something happens, or, yeah, some folks have come, cleaners in one section of Cape Town came to the Housing Assembly once because they wanted to develop some social power around a strike. And then that was really good for a while, lots of things were accomplished, and then most of those people kind of moved on, but some stayed, and you know. So it's kind of, yeah, you jump at the chance for an opportunity for employment, and the basic material conditions of everyday life are such that no one judges people, you know. But there's been a big uptick in kind of like workfare in South Africa, these expanded public works programs where you get like little tiny wage to go clean the streets, and you're working alongside like unionized municipal workers, so it also helps to undermine organizing, at least relative to the city, in the city's eyes. But so you're sweeping the streets and doing this thing, and then you can't get a job for many, many years, and after that you're not eligible anymore. So it's like just kind of giving job opportunities and circling them around so somebody gets a little bit. And a lot of people organizing now into some of this have just said, I'm just not going to do it. It's such a small amount of money, and it's going to take me away from what I'm doing. And I just think to myself, wow, because that's a really difficult choice. That's not even a choice. People's living conditions are so bad. So it's very interesting. The one thing that I guess is the backstop to all this is the social grant system. So the non-contributory social grant and pension system. So cash transfers, essentially. So there's 7 or 8 different types: child grant, disability grant, pensions, and so on. So it's those are a bit of a backstop, and they've really helped alleviate poverty, but they certainly haven't turned the tide. Coalitions with unions, political parties. There's a long history of this. I actually got to this by looking at social movement unionism. So this idea that workers and communities come together to create like large, like big kind of broader coalitions, mobilize a lot of social power. This was huge in the fight against apartheid, but post-apartheid it's been relatively few and far between in terms of the cases. It takes a lot, but a very strong union has recently broken away from the main union federation. COSATU is aligned with ANC, the ruling party. A strong union broke away from that ruling federation. There's now an alternative federation, and that union, NUMSA, has launched a working class party that will be contesting elections. But I go through the sort of problematics of that in the longer paper. It has a sort of business union bureaucratized past, or history, pardon me, and it's really like, it's kind of a rent-a-crowd when it comes to the Housing Assembly. And that's one of the problems. They don't see these struggles as like class struggles, really. They're like, oh yeah, they're important, but like, we're just going to shut things down in the workplace. And they are very strong and they're very powerful, but I mean, I think on their own they have little, their ability to be able to contest elections is going to be pretty low, I think, at least successfully pretty low. And so these are the sort of the problematics. They're not real sort of rank and file, both workplace and community speaking, organizing kind of drives. They're very bureaucratic and top down. They had a big working class summit to kind of like build the process for creating this party in I guess in the summer, and or maybe early fall, at least our fall. Folks from the Housing Assembly went, and it was almost like you were being told what to say. There was a huge fight. all the community organizations with good politics and who were into democracy, they were an uphill battle the whole time. So, yeah. That's really interesting, talking about the community, sort of the difference between pride and then, so these organizing kind of door-to-door kind of things, people walk around and they talk to people in their houses, like, what's your experience of water, like, and so organize, get demands, invite people to meetings and so on, and so it's people know what their problems are, they talk about it, they're proud in a lot of different ways, but I don't know if the pride of place, what you're getting at, is something that they come up against that much. Sometimes they've come up against divisions, like on this side of the highway you'll have like a sort of a middle, even in the townships, you'll have a sort of quasi-middle class area, and then over here you'll have a large informal settlement, and people will say, well, we don't want you burning tires on the road to get access to services because that lowers our property value. And it gets really heated when there's meetings. So there is some of that, but within communities, I don't know, I haven't felt that there's that sort of, that's a really big obstacle. People take more pride, I think, in the institutions, like the social fabric that they build with each other. Yeah, that's interesting though, yeah. I don't know, I've never really come across it, and I've done a lot of like door-to-door organizing and stuff. Yeah. People are more interested that they're really, wait, are you a political party? What are you doing here? Are you from a religious denomination? What do you want from me in return for this? And it's like, what are you giving me? I'm like, well, I'm not really giving you anything. Do you want to talk about what's going on? It's a very like basic conversation, which then becomes more complex over time. But yeah, something interesting to think about that. Any questions?
Let's say today in South Africa, if I'm a South African and I got sick, or maybe the child got sick, and then we go to hospital or clinic,
Yeah.
do they need to pay a fee or no?
Not always, no. I mean, there's two-tiered healthcare, so there are lots of private hospitals, some of the best in the world. There is public healthcare, but it's not very good. Sometimes people don't want to go to the hospital. They just go to the pharmacy and ask for some sort of drug and advice there to solve a problem. And unfortunately, in the budget last year, Cyril Ramaphosa's first budget, they cut. What did they cut? In real terms, yeah, they cut our 1.2 billion from health infrastructure. Yeah, they cut education infrastructure by our 14 billion, even though free education below a certain amount, like below a certain level of household income, free tertiary education has been provided, but the matric and elementary school test scores, so secondary and elementary school test scores in South Africa are already some of the worst on the continent, and now they're cutting education infrastructure and cutting schools, which is really really tough. But yeah, you can go and you can get service. Mm-hmm. You wait a very long time. There were other hands too.
Yeah. So how do you propose to solve this water crisis and housing crisis?
Sorry?
How do you propose as a solution to handle this crisis?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can forward you the Housing Assembly's sort of list of demands. I don't know, I think there needs to be a turn away from, like sort of at a macro level, a turn away from austerity. So there's, I mean, the unfortunate thing is that I think since the summer, South Africa's been in a technical recession. So, I mean, that's tough in terms of, growth estimates not being met. But I think the response by the most recent government, Cyril Ramaphosa, so replacing Jacob Zuma, who was ousted because of corruption and so on, which is quite, I mean, that's a legitimate, it was a legitimate charge for sure. His strategy has really been to double down, increase the value-added tax, left taxes on corporations and the rich the same, Just sort of moving things around in the public budget, but in real terms, not adding everything. Cut the public workforce, further corporatizing services like ESCOM, the energy generation distribution, and so on. So it's been split up into 3, which is going to be corporatized. So I mean, there's a lot of different things you could do at like a macro level. Public financing of investment in infrastructure. There's also a wage bill that was passed setting a minimum wage at our 20 Rand an hour, so about $2 an hour Canadian in December. But it really undermines the right to collectively organize, bargain, and strike. So overall, it sort of sets a line, although certain jobs like domestic work are going to be lower than that. There's a lot of exemptions. The former labor laws have never really been enforced that well, so there's no suggestion that the new labor laws will be. They've also removed the sort of body that will oversee that and pushed it all on the CCMA, which is like the sort of, it's where you go to argue your labor court case, but they're like years behind, and there hasn't been any new money put into that. So it's kind of an offloading, but it says, hey, you're gonna get this minimum wage, but odds are you're not. And in some sectors where there's been sectoral standards set, it will actually lower the minimum wage. So, I mean, all of these things that we know from good analytical work that's been done by people on the left and even by the World Bank and the IMF, like, you know, unions mean people have more money in their pockets, they decrease inequality. Stuff like that, and investments in public infrastructure, they're just not forthcoming. So I mean, I think that would be a good way to do it. You could use the public pension funds for financing. There's just so many different things that could be done. Cut down on illicit financial flows, like capital flight is still huge from South Africa. I mean, these are just like basic things that as a globe we've actually completely failed on in terms of, you know, like meeting the SDGs. These things were on the agenda, but they were blocked by the countries of the North anyway. So, I mean, these are all things I think that could be done on a macro level to make this situation better. And then, you know, I don't know, they cut 9 billion Rand from almost $1 billion Canadian from the housing budget at the federal level in the budget last year. And the whole line now is, well, if you're over 40, you weren't affected by apartheid, so you're not going to get a public house. So pull up your socks and, I don't know, get a loan or something like that. And I mean, I could go into housing policy in South Africa post-apartheid, but that's a whole other discussion. So there's a lot of obstacles, but those are some of the kind of more macro ideas for this. But if political will is not there, it's not going to happen. So, yeah. Are there any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Question. If I understood properly, I'm not super familiar with social reproduction theory, but I think you said that struggles against racism, homophobia, and other types of injustices are potentially also struggles against capitalism. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if in your research you found that those things like racism and homophobia were obstacles to organizing people and how that played out. Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's huge. I think I mentioned at some point there that that these are a big part of the organizing process. So I mean, you can imagine post-apartheid South Africa severely cut across by race, ethnicity, and so on. And so these are played upon by, you know, you have a set budget that's supposed to not pick and choose on the basis of any sort of social distinction, and yet in a society divided particularly along the lines of race, what happens is that if a small budget, totally insufficient amount of resources are put towards fixing a problem that so many more people have, anything that's over here was going to be, well, why are they getting it? You know, and why are they getting it? And so this is a huge issue. And I mentioned the the case of women going around and having conversations with people about like race and work and migration in South Africa. So a lot of the Western Cape was a so-called colored work preference area under apartheid, and so that's where most of people who fall into that apartheid area classification live, and work on those farms. And they had special privileges, which were really awful and impressive in many other ways, but they had privileges of a certain sort. And now a lot of people are coming from the Eastern Cape, and these are mostly Xhosa-speaking, so-called African citizens of South Africa coming in. And now there's this like, so there's a class difference that's immediately put, because the so-called colored people who don't live on farms usually live in some sort of formal state housing. Not always, but a lot of them do, at least in this town where this alliance happened. And then new people are coming in and they're living in shacks. And so you have this immediate sort of line set up. There's a linguistic barrier between Afrikaans and Xhosa. There's so many barriers set up. And the farmers, the very rich capitalist farmers, very, very rich, and the municipality, whom they just like run like it's their private police force, these people are constantly, implicitly but explicitly playing groups off of each other. Like, it's just blatant, you know, in terms of statements. So it's both sort of an outcome, an unavoidable outcome of this small investment that's meant to address these issues in a society stratified such that it is, but it's also very, very deliberate. You know, it's a strategy of dividing people. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, that's a big problem. I don't know if that speaks to your sort of question. So
I'm gonna ask you more later, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. But in terms of, you know, whether or not these struggles are part of class struggles, it's not the sense that class determines them or anything like that. It's the notion that life is experienced all together and all at once. And once these things are mixed, you know, any sort of social relation that differentially delivers a worker to the boss, at least so the argument goes, is one that's going to be, there are going to be forces that continue to perpetuate that in society, right? And these are not obviously just, these are not restricted to South Africa. It's just particularly strong. And there are cultural sort of like artifacts, I don't know, anyway, left over from apartheid. Things like the Svartgava, which in Afrikaans is the black threat. And so it's this idea that you have this in the Western Cape, around Cape Town, so-called colored folks during apartheid, they enjoyed some privileges, and there are all these people outside, and they're coming and they're going to steal them. And so there's this deep-seated fear by people, you know, who are in their 40s now. I'm scared of these people, you know, or I'm scared, or those people are really, they're you know, very violent, and, you know, so people don't speak to each other, and so it's a lot of very deep-seated stuff. And then when it's played upon, it's like, boom, it blows up because it's so right there, ready to explode. And then in Cape Town is also a very interesting place because it's the city in apartheid that is like the ideal, so-called ideal apartheid city, where you have a line, and the rich white folks were against the mountain, and everyone else was out here. So it's not the most unequal city in South Africa. Joburg is far more unequal. But it feels like the most unequal because there's like one really big line. But there's this notion in South Africa that, well, Cape Town isn't racist like Joburg, or Cape Town isn't racist like other places. But according to the people that live there who are critical about this, like the folks I work with, it's really, really not the case. So it hasn't been dealt with in some ways like it's been dealt with in other cities in South Africa, just because a lot of people don't have to deal with it, because they can separate themselves from it. So there's some very interesting attitudes in those relationships as well, which play themselves out in NGO spaces that are supposed to be critical and progressive. It's very, very odd. But yeah, feel free to ask me more later.
All right.
No.
Good. Unless you, I mean, maybe we can all join us in thanking Adrian for an interesting talk.
Thank you. Thanks.
And hope to see you all at the Ben Cohen talk.
Thanks. Thanks very much, guys.
Excellent, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing, right? That's great, Adrian. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your kind comments, eh?
Wonderful ideas and really well articulated. That's great. Beautiful writing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I don't know if I feel like it's not my best, whatever, but writing is not my forte.
No, disagree based on what I just heard.
I mean, it's.
The number of years I've been working on that.
No, it seems like it's going to happen, for sure. Oh, fascinating, you know, the way that
Well, I think.
history, space, affect,
Yeah.
you know, there's so much to unpack there.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
What's happening, no.
Study it around the classroom.
Yeah.
Oh, at least every once in a
I'm
while.
interested, I was going to ask you a little bit about
Sometimes two.
also how SRT kind of plays into you know, gender relationships within the household,
Nice to meet you as well.
household bargaining and stuff like that, but for another time. It's
Oh,
probably
yeah.
another-
No, it's a huge thing. Like gender within the household and within the organization itself. Oh my God, it's ridiculous. It's crazy. You actually get like with the so-called
Watch the camera.
But they put policies in place. No, this does not happen. Collectively provision, and then they generalize that. And like they do a feminist activist course. It's like these, it's crazy, right? And I mean, people were doing this in apartheid too. It's not a new thing, but it's remarkable. Yeah. But how the labor breaks down, it's super problematic. But that's what you mean by like that household level?
Yeah, especially, I'm trying to explain, you know, what it means to try and raise a child when there's water shortages, you know, domestic uses versus how do you even, in conditions of scarcity, how do you allocate resources in the household, how do you take seriously someone's unpaid work in the household, and, you know, sweeping out the amount of work that goes into cleaning the house. Things, you know, that might be
Totally, it is.
maybe not as strong, as keenly felt, because I'm sure the rounds are a bit easier, but, you know, anyway.
Yeah, and a big thing is like stealing away young women's lives
You don't need me there?
because they get kicked out of school.
I wasn't sure, that's why I asked you, like, I thought you wanted something.
And they just end up being
In terms of the process.
they're a loved member of the family, but they don't get to go to school. They're just
No.
so this is like the reality for youth. Young women, like they stay at home, or you know they get into drugs or sex work, and the young men get into drugs and gangsterism. Because there's no jobs, like 60-something% of youth unemployment. So it's like that's what's being sacrificed for this kind of stuff.
They don't care either way.
To
It's up to you.
continue.
And then,
But that's super fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's really political young women talking about this, like within the movement, and not like the university types. Like I'm talking like people who might have graduated high school, but like they're developing like some really incredible analysis, which is kind of that's cool. Anyway, I want to work more with the theory for sure, because it's the best thing that has. It's the closest thing I can say that approximates what's happening.
No, like I said, I think the way you could move very quickly from empirical examples to theoretical exposition was just, it's great. It's great, really good.
I'm glad you thought so.
But,
Yeah,
no, I think
thank
it's
you
really
so
good
much.
work.
eh?
Yeah, we'll see
All right.
you
Around.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Cheers.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris.
There you go.
All right.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, nice to meet you, man.
Yeah?
Yeah, this slide is a bit of what? That's like a different world.
What? Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, you're like you do a lot of like stats and numbers, hey?
Yeah,
In your work,
yeah,
it's lots
that's
of
what I do.
data, right?
Yeah, but
Yeah.